course, the general panorama, the general vision of agricultural labor and migration, it's not only Mexico, and it's not only Mexico, Canada, and the United States. It's really a global issue. Through the last century and a half, there has been a lot of workers' fights to defend their civil and labor rights. And somehow the agricultural sector has managed to stay back like 100 years, like it was 100 years ago. So while most workers, at least in principle, have basic labor standards, and that means an 8 hours day of work and a 40 hours week and health and safety protection and mechanisms to protect them against unjustified dismissals and reprisals. In the agricultural sector, the legislation in Mexico, United States, and Canada continues to consider the labor relationship between the employer and the employee as an informal and very like family-oriented labor relation. So that brings problems in terms of protections for the worker, but also it gives really an unjust and unfair scope for the employer, where they can pretty much do whatever they want with this workforce, hire them when they need them, and then use them as as they please, and then throw them away, and assuming no responsibility. And that goes for wages, but also for basic like health and safety protections. In the particular case of Mexico, United States, and Canada, we see the integration of a workforce, of a labor market, where the most vulnerable people, most of them are of indigenous descent, they have very few education, they don't have family ties with the community where they arrive, so they are, we'll say, at the lowest of the scale. So we have an economic factor that intertwines with a social, cultural, and economic situation, and that allows for horrendous labor conditions. When we speak about the situation in Baja California, the organizations that work directly with the jornaleros, with the day laborers, say that this is not an isolated situation. There were political and specific conditions that allowed for the San Quintin workers to organize and rise and demand their rights. But we can say that this situation is a national situation, at least for Mexico. It happens everywhere, and that it's also happening in Canada and the United States. Why? Because governments allow for the agro industry, for the big business, big agro, it's not a family farm, to exploit workers. There's no due legislation, and when the legislation does exist, there's no enforcement mechanisms. So what we have is people who are living way below the living like minimum wage. Workers are paid 90 pesos, which is absolutely ridiculous for journeys that go from 12 to 14 hours in very harsh weather situations and with no protection from the authority. So we'll say there's a workforce, there's the capital or the employers, and then there's the authorities. And in this balance between the employee and the employer, the authorities are not doing their due diligence, we would say. What workers were asking were very basic rights, like a minimum wage of 200 pesos, but also enforcement for current legislation. So there are inspections in the farms that make sure there are housing conditions, water when the workers are outside in the fields, no child labor, because many complain about being forced to force their own children to work with them, sexual abuse and harassment, and also no mechanisms against unjustified dismissals and reprisals for organizing. We are trying to support as the labor movement, we as UFCW, we of course endorse and support this organization and this rising of the workers. We know that the organizations that are on the fields, people like the FIOP and Tlachinolan and the other organizations that are accompanying the workers, are trying to put this agenda on the public opinion, because that's one of the main concerns. Agricultural workers are invisible workers. We don't see them every day, and we get food from them at least 3 times a day, but we are not paying our share as a society. So the burden of having a national industry, a national agricultural industry, is right now is only assumed by the workers.